Hi, I'm Michael. I hope you enjoyed this presentation today. This is the first of a series of 4 slide presentations and videos that I'll be providing for you. This presentation deals with productivity as a definition, and I'll talk a bit about the model detailing productivity and engagement, because they're the 2 variables we need to look at. And then the metaphor I've developed to sort of help illustrate productivity and how better productivity will benefit you, and give you some examples, some real examples from the field about how this can be useful for you. Then we're going to talk about being effective and efficient. I've also developed a model for this and have a metaphor to give you some examples of how that can work for you. We'll talk about clinical excellence and commercial success. We'll then talk about how you go about creating the right focus for your work. Talk about mentoring. Then we'll talk about the 3 A's. That'll be detailed within the presentation. The structuring of your consult with your patient, and then commercial behaviours, detailing what that really means, and then how you can create some objectives to be more commercial in your practice, because this is also a very key part of being more productive. We'll talk about the model now. What do I mean by the model? Well, I've got a 4-quadrant model that you can see on the slides that talks about productivity and engagement. The highest level of this model would be those that are both productive and engaged. Usually these people are high revenue generators in a practice and usually have clinical credibility that is seen by most as being at a very high level. You can be productive, yet you can be disengaged, possibly arrogant, generally underperforming, and although they may be making a good income, they're not really seen as being truly engaged and enthusiastic in the process of creating their patient's improvement. Then you can be non-productive yet engaged. This is usually the younger clinician who just comes into practice, where they're enthusiastic, but they lack direction. They don't understand what they need to do to try and improve themselves, to be more productive and hence to be in a better position to earn more. The final group are those that are non-productive and disengaged. This is the sort of individual who you really wonder whether they should be in clinical practice in a healing healthcare profession, because they're generally idle and often ineffective with what they do, both clinically and commercially. And I've often had hard discussions with people like this to say, well, is this really what you want to do? I do recall a situation with a fellow who was not achieving any of his goals, and he came to me one day and said, I'm going to go into banking. And he's been successful in banking, interestingly enough. So a change of career is not always a bad thing. Sometimes having a metaphor that isn't particularly aligned to the topic you're talking about gives people a greater level of understanding. And the metaphor that I've created for productivity in clinical setting or in a general setting is upgrading new software in your computer usually improves your productivity. If you're using old programs and the software is not compatible with your computer anymore or not working effectively, it's very difficult to be productive. And if you actually think about this in relation to a clinical practice, if you're not doing the ongoing education that you need to do, you're not looking at ways in which you can improve what you do, both clinically and commercially, then you're not going to be as effective either. So I think the metaphor is effective in this context. So how productivity will benefit you? There's a number of areas that I believe productivity will be of great benefit to you in your practice and in your life. Firstly, your earning potential will grow because you'll find that you can be more effective with your patients and able to really develop a greater fee for each patient that you see, and also then start to focus on how you can improve the amount of billings that you develop for every hour that you work. We'll talk about how productivity will actually improve your clinical practice. You'll become actually a better clinician because you'll be able to focus on what is important. You'll be able to actually develop your skills because you'll be able to manage your time better. We see that you'll have a greater level of confidence and satisfaction and progress with your career. One of the things that we notice, unfortunately, in clinical practice is that a number of practitioners now are actually leaving their profession earlier than they would have normally because they haven't been able to develop a decent income in their practice. So we think this is another aspect that will actually help you to progress your career. Balancing your time will be important. You'll be more productive if you can balance your time and use your time more effectively. You'll have greater enthusiasm and engagement with your patients. And you're going to have a greater opportunity to develop relationships with other clinicians that will help you develop your career, because career development opportunities come through developing networks, developing good close contacts within the practice you work in, but also outside that practice and in your profession generally, where you'll network at conferences and you'll network at events, and these give you often opportunities to get involved with sports clubs or to do other work that may be of great interest to you. Does this work? Well, we conducted a survey of around 85 clinicians, and in that survey, we asked them to actually indicate which of the actual activities we had with the commercial mentoring or the productivity sessions that they had or the clinical sessions that they had, did they attend these things? We then had some external measures about their general performance. We found that over the 85 clinicians, nearly 40% of the people generated a higher dollar per hour performance over the period of 6 months. What we also found was the 38% that improved correlated directly with those that had applied themselves to doing the actual process and the systems that we developed. The ones that engaged more fully with the system and the things I'm talking about had a higher commercial performance. The next thing we looked at was the rankings of performance based on the billings that clinicians made on an hourly basis. And we ranked clinicians from those that billed the most in an hour to those that billed the least over a defined period. Funnily enough, we found that those that had the best the best commercial outcome with the highest dollars per hour were also acknowledged by others as being the best people clinically. So we saw a direct correlation between clinical performance and commercial productivity, which tends to mean that commercial productivity is a part of good clinical performance. And then I could go on, I won't. There are stories of clinicians and how they performed where they came from a very low level and improved over a 4 or 5 year period and started to develop some of their own techniques and messages and ideas about how they could be better at what they do. So some of those stories are others that I've seen and they get repeated again and again and again. So it does work, it's effective, but you've got to apply yourself to it. You've got to be engaged. To illustrate some of the points that we've made in the previous slide, I want to talk to you about a practitioner who we'll call RL and how he improved his productivity through working with the models that we developed for him of in the commercial mentoring process, but also in the process of practice development. So RL came up with a pretty simple approach to how he could improve his productivity, and he highlights 4 matters of importance. The first is that of writing effective letters. The letter that you write will depend a lot on the person that's receiving the letter. It may be a general practitioner, it may be a specialist, it may be someone that referred to you from a sports club or a coach. So therefore your letters and response need to be fit for purpose. They need to detail the amount of time you've spent and show, hopefully, the skill that you've actually developed over time. Some will be longer, some will be shorter, but really what is important is that if someone refers to you, they must get a letter within 24 hours. And in the letter, you will highlight things such as the diagnosis as you saw it, what signs and symptoms you saw, and how you're going to approach this person with treatment. This then gives you the opportunity to show direction to the GP, if it's a GP that referred the patient, and demonstrate and highlight your skills to that GP. At the same time, often if there's some difference in the diagnosis that you feel, you can highlight that to the GP without embarrassing the GP from a perspective of his own expertise or skill. The second thing that you need to do is to develop what we call a USP, a unique selling proposition. What does this mean? This means that something that you've got, that you've developed over time, that is very specific to you in your skill set. It's something that's difficult for a younger practitioner to have because they're not always aware of what their skill is when they first start practice. But it's something you need to look at from the perspective of, what am I interested in? And then once you develop that, as it might be you're interested in headache or lower limb pain or knee injuries, whatever the case may be, you then need to find a mentor who can assist you to be clinically excellent. So then you develop a unique talent in a specific area, hips, shoulders, spinal, whatever that it might be. And once you develop this USP, it's something you can then use to sell yourself to specific clinicians. The question I've often been asked is, but if I'm just seen to be good at elbows, will I be referred any other patients? Generally speaking, you can be rest assured that if you've developed a specific expertise, referrers will look at you and say, oh yes, Jack is very good at elbows, but I suspect he's obviously very good at other things as well. So they will refer to you for other conditions that they need treated. The next one of the sort of stories is that he developed what his target population was. Where you work, where they work, the way they work, and observe other clinicians who you can target and learn from. Because then you'll find that they have their own network of referrers and you can then tap into their referrers as well. And understanding what your ideal patient is. So if you're a mid-30s active athletic person yourself, you might want to see these sorts of people in your own practice. So it's a good idea to try and understand who your ideal patient is. Then we look at the networks. Find specific networks for your interest type. So if you're interested in shoulders, who are the shoulder surgeons who are specialists? Are there tennis players that are in a club near you because they often have shoulder problems? Swimmers are another group that you could target. So find the network that's specific to your specific interest or your special interest. And know who is good at what and use them. Ironically, the particular fellow RL who I'm talking about used to get a lot of medico-legal patients referred to him from lawyers because lawyers would get very good letters from him and they identified he had an expertise. So with other patients that were having difficulties with, say, a workers' compensation claim, for example, the lawyer would say, why don't you go and get an appointment with RL? He should be able to help you. So you need to set your own plan because RL has made his. So what will be your plan? So the next thing that we're going to talk about in this presentation for you today is about being effective with people and efficient with things. And let me explain to you what that means. I've also developed a 4-quadrant model where we look at effectiveness on the y-axis and efficiency on the x-axis of a little 4-quadrant model. And in the top corner, we have effective and efficient, being effective and efficient. What does that mean? Well, that's really where we want to aim to be. Someone who's effective is someone who's organised, as a good communicator, and being efficient means that you can actually get things done in an appropriate and proper way. This is the ultimate goal you would aim for. You can then be effective but inefficient. And this type of individual is often a little disorganised, but they're a good communicator. They can communicate with people, they just don't manage their time well. The third area would be to be ineffective but inefficient. This person is often disorganised and a poor communicator, but this is the sort of person that we really need to work with to assist to be a little more efficient, but also to be a better communicator with people. The final group are those that are ineffective and efficient. These people are usually a poor communicator, but they are organised. So we need to work with those people to try and help them be better at what they do. So therefore, the metaphor that I use to talk about efficiency and effectiveness is that there are many paths to the top of the mountain. It's important to recognise what your skill set is because people have different skills. Some are good with people and others are better with activities or what I call the things of life. And they're not necessarily that great with people. Understanding what your skill set is an important factor in being more productive. Because if you are feeling as though you have great knowledge, you've got a really good background, or you've done a lot of learning, but you've not been a great communicator, you don't develop relationships easily, you don't develop friends easily, you feel it a little bit tiresome to make the effort sometimes with people, you need to really work on how you can become more effective in your dealings with people. Getting the outcome is what counts really, but understanding your strengths and working on those is really a key to actually being both efficient and effective. So work out where you feel you are lacking and then work on that area correspondingly. So let's talk about some stories that relate directly to what I'm talking about with this and getting the right people in the right roles. And in this instance, I'm going to use JF and MK. In this instance, MK is myself, and how you can work together with somebody else and how you can use the roles of being effective in someone else and efficient using their skills to match yours. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about in practice management and accounting setting, and this really doesn't relate to clinical practice, but this is a really interesting example of two people. One was the practice manager at a large multidisciplinary practice. The other one was the accountant. And if I'd put the accountant person in the practice manager role, we would have had problems because she didn't deal well with people. She was very good and very, very efficient in the back room. She worked well on her own. She didn't work well with other people. This is not the sort of role you want with a practice manager who's going to be dealing with not just the patients, but also with the staff, dealing with their issues, their concerns, understanding how these people work and how they can be made and helped to work better. So we really need to make sure that we get the right people in the right roles. So this may not apply to you if you're necessarily a young practitioner just starting in your practice. But if you run a practice, think about who is fit for purpose for the specific roles. And I do remember a situation some years ago where I basically decided there was one particular individual who used to work at the front desk who was a little bit brash, who didn't really want to engage with the patients. But once I put her into the backroom role, she did a fantastic job with the accounts, with the spreadsheets, with the pays, all those sorts of matters. And then that enabled us to bring somebody else in to run the front desk. So really relating back to the story relating to myself and JF, JF came from a more academic background, was very structured in the work that he did. He had a very linear approach, so A to B to C to D, and didn't deal well with things coming from left of field, particularly when they related personal interaction. He took a more long-term view. He was very good at creating a goal, and that would lead him very strongly towards the goal. The goal might be a 2-year process. And the other thing that he was able to do that I wasn't so strong on was actually work through the process. So he could take a process from the very start and take it through to the end without really being interrupted, and was very productive when he did that. His accountability was demonstrated through documentation. So his work output was around how many documents he produced, how many processes he produced, what the policies were, and a number of these sorts of things. But he had a style that really wasn't effective with people. And in fact, he coined this phrase, not I. He called himself a benevolent dictator. But in this case, he was more the dictator. And I'll never forget one time I spoke to him about how he was working with a particular individual. And he said, "Oh, you get people to do things because you have more authority than me." I said, "No, I get people to be helpful in doing things by being more relationship orientated. It's not about a title or where you stand. So if you're the practice owner, you don't want to be a dictator with what you do. You want to be about to be open to people." When I mentioned SMC influence, that relates to Sports Medicine Centres of Victoria, where we had a very large practice. And at the end of that, you'll note I've put things efficient. Whereas in my own situation, I have a more anecdotal style. I develop rapport with people. I talk about stories. I talk about how we can communicate. I talk about areas of common interest. It's a little less structured, but more effective. And it's actually about selling the message or selling the vision of the business that I was involved in. On the benevolence side, I was the person that people came to when they had an issue or they had a problem or they were upset. And I think this was always really helpful because there's a number of staff who deal with a number of issues from home or from other parts of their life, and they will need someone that's prepared to listen to them. I also had an influence from what I did at SMC, Sports Medicine Centres, because I was the people side of that. And therefore, I've put at the end of my group of titles there, being effective with people. So really, it's okay to look at these sorts of things, but does this work? I think the practice stories that I've demonstrated from RL and from more recently from JF and myself demonstrate that with changes where clinical excellence was paramount but understood, and where commercial behaviours were used and implemented in the right way and in the right practices, we needed to make sure we had the right people in the right jobs. So it's going to be important to emphasise to you that if you do these things, how that can make you more productive, make your practice more productive. And often being aware of what your role is or how you see yourself is important, but it's also very important about how others see you. So we'll go into this a little bit later on in some of the other topics we'll talk about, but getting feedback from people and getting honest feedback from people that you trust is always going to be important. So don't be shy of getting someone to tell you how they think you're going. You may have a particular view about how you're going, but it needs to align with how others see that you're going, particularly those that you can trust. So ultimately, your objectives are pretty simple: to be clinically excellent and to be commercially successful. The two work hand in hand, and I encourage you to look at the commercial side very closely, because often clinical performance is something that's as a given in your professional training, but you have to learn how to be commercially successful, and that will create a better lifestyle with you, with better balance, and you'll be able to do more of the things you want to do in your life if you manage to achieve the commercial success to go with your clinical excellence. So why should clinical excellence and commercial success be your objectives? And this is always something that we were aware of when we developed practices and developing people, that you needed with clinicians to come from clinical excellence first. That is the expected deliverable. So therefore, you really can't be fully commercially successful unless you develop clinical excellence. Everybody will have examples of those that are very commercially focused, but oftentimes they also have come from a strong clinical background. It's unusual to see someone be commercially successful without some degree of clinical of acumen in clinical matters. And commercial success is not the focus of practitioners, but ironically, some of this depends on the type of training that you've had. I know that with some chiropractic and osteopathic courses, they study some matters of business and marketing and actually talk about some of the issues I'm talking about. But many of the clinical practices really focus very much on the evidence base, the clinical side, the clinical techniques, the clinical learning, without working that should be very important in a commercial sense. Bearing in mind that most practitioners in allied health, the large majority, will actually be going into private practice to earn their income. So therefore, we think this focus is vitally important. So really you need to have both, but not just have both to be happy in your practice, but to be satisfied with your career, and consequently to develop any degree of financial independence. We often see people happy in their practice up to a certain time till they realise they want to have other objectives, like they want to start a family or they want to travel or they want to have time off from their practice, and they can't do that because they haven't got the independence in the practice that they work in, either from the patients that they see by growing relatively strong income from doing that, or by owning a practice and making that practice profitable. So these two elements combine, because we may be talking in this audience to those who are a new practitioner or for those that are running a practice. So some of these skills apply differently in those different circumstances. But really, it's no good being in clinical practice if you haven't got a commercial focus. So let's talk about focus now. And what that means, what does it mean to have a clear focus on what you're trying to do? If you have a clear focus, you will learn more, you will treat more because you'll have a greater number of patients to treat. That will mean that you grow more, not just in your practice, but as a person, because the more patients you interact with and the more people you treat, the greater level of skill you have, the greater competence with manual handling, your clinical reasoning will improve as well. Focus will also help you to be more satisfied in the day-to-day interactions with your patients, the weeks you spend in practice, but generally because you'll be seeing greater results with your patients, you'll have that degree of satisfaction from doing that. And with this will come being more successful both in patient interactions and in the interactions you have with other people as well. So one area that I often talk about and I think is crucial for everybody is to look at the idea of having mentors. And being productive and improving your productivity comes around to having those that can help you develop in your plan. I can remember in my own career, and in fact, even when I was at school, I remember a particular teacher I had who was also my high jumping athletics coach, and he was the first mentor that I had. I then went into university, and towards the end of my study as a physiotherapist, I met another chap who was an older guy studying postgrad who took me under his wing, and I used to go and watch Tony work clinically. Often two afternoons a week, I'd go to his practice and watch him work and learn from him working. I then, when I went into the business world, had a very prominent fellow who was an accountant, Bill, who helped me with the issue of understanding more of the commercial aspects of practice, and he taught me a lot. And then when I went into the corporate world, I had other mentors. I had Lou and Ross, who also assisted me to understand more about corporate machinations. And then finally, a very difficult man that I dealt with, but one that was very important for me, was a fellow called Ralph, who was a corporate consultant, who also taught me a lot. But at the same time, I had to deal with him being rather ineffective because he was a bit of a bully, and that was a difficult thing to deal with. So I'm going to talk about both clinical and commercial mentors, but first we want to talk about a clinical one. So how do we find somebody like this? You'd be surprised as a clinician. There are many clinicians out there who are very happy to support younger clinicians in whatever field they may be. So finding someone who's had clinical experience, who's busy as a clinician, who's actually also busy as a teacher. They may run courses, they may have affiliations with elite sport. They're often very good communicators, and they're the sort of people that you want to try and find as a mentor, someone to support you. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone in your own practice, but it can be someone that you feel as though you could benefit from spending time with. And the areas you're looking for a clinical mentor to assist you with, if you're a young clinician particularly, is clinical reasoning. This is basically understanding the process of the consultation and the information you gather, which enables then to reason out what the approach for treatment will be. Manual handling. There's only a certain amount of manual handling techniques and skills you can gain from your undergraduate course. This is something that comes with experience. And I'll often recommend to people that to get extra manual handling, they not just get a mentor, but they go and work in sports clubs where there's less pressured environment of having patient after patient come and see you. Even volunteering your time to do that can be very useful as well. So the manual handling, if you've got a mentor, should be, what can I learn a new technique every month? Will they introduce me to a particular way of holding the patient when you're doing an examination technique, etc.? Reviewing articles, these sorts of mentors are often well read, and they will be able to say, okay, you need to go and have a look at the article about whatever it may be, shoulders, knees, this has been published by so-and-so. You need to read these articles before we meet the next time. Then demonstration of the techniques is again part of the manual handling process. Case reviews, them presenting cases to you, or you, in fact, between visits with your clinical mentor, you actually present a case of a patient that you've seen to them. Recommendation is really them recommending for you why don't you go and do this course, or why don't you go and do that course? So rather than just signing up for every course that's available, try and see if you can get that sort of information from your mentor. And then also, a mentor will often help you with a process I talked about before, which is developing a clinical, unique selling proposition. And this will become crucial for you as you develop your practice, because you'll gain expertise in that particular area of special interest. It doesn't mean you're a specialist, it means you've got a special interest. It helps to be a specialist as well, if you can do that. But having a USP is something I ask every young practitioner. What is your USP? I don't know. Start thinking about what you enjoy doing, what you feel you actually do or get a good result of when you treat people. It may be knees, it may be ankles. Whatever it is, try and look at how you can develop your own unique selling proposition. Commercial mentors. This is a trickier area because we find it difficult to find somebody that's necessarily good at being both a clinical and a commercial mentor. So what I usually start with is that for you, start with the premise that clinical competence is king. It makes it somewhat easier to actually then look at how you might go about finding a commercial mentor. And as I've said before, in the practices over networks I used to run, I would often identify 3 to 5 very good clinical mentors. And of those, you'd often only find 1 or 2 that could also be a commercial mentor, because they weren't able to convey a lot of the principles I'm talking about now in relation to productivity, but in relation to key performance indicators, in relation to reviewing performance, in relation to setting a plan up. So how do you find one? Well, you're really looking for experienced, successful clinicians or practice owners who actually have an interest in the activities of not just running the practice, but working on the practice rather than just in the practice. So they know their numbers, they're often able to communicate and teach those numbers to you. And I was about to say, they've not often got the best communication skills, but if they can, and you get them on their topic, they'll be very useful for you to help you with some of these matters. I've mentioned it's usually someone that's different from a clinical mentor, and these are the sort of people that help you develop the ACO, I call it, which is the plan I use called Achieving Your Career Objectives. And this is a document that we've created that is very useful for helping people get an annual plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ACO in later presentations that we do. But that's going to be very important, whether it's that document or another. It's something that we can certainly help you with. This person who's your mentor should be looking to help review you quarterly. They may spend time with you every month of a couple of hours, helping and looking at ways in which you improve referrers, ways in which you can improve your productivity in dollars per hour, ways in which you can grow your practice. But then they will look at the results from your review quarterly. And we developed a document we called the AQR, the quarterly review plan that you could look at and therefore include your data as to how you're performing. And these people will more often not assist you with sales training, how you can go about getting somebody who, it may be a club or it may be a particular referrer, but how you might go about getting referrals or patients sent to you from those people. By developing your skills in what we call relationship marketing, business development. And we talk a little bit more about that in later presentations as well. The 3 A's I'm going to go through, it's actually 4 A's we can go through, but you can have a look from the model that's on the slide in front of you that I've actually lined out about how you get the best clinical result. And you may be surprised at where I've put ability in the A's, because I've got a 4th A, which is action. And really ability is the bedrock of what you do, but it's also not necessarily the most important thing. So you need to have ability to apply reasoning and show techniques or develop techniques or apply techniques to your patient, but that's not the only thing you need to do. You need to be available. And what does this mean? It means that when you start your practice, the more you're available, the more options there are for patients to come and see you. So if patients can make an appointment in a timely fashion, you're more likely to be able to build your practice. What does that mean? It means that Sometimes after hours work is necessary, either before 8 o'clock in the morning or after 6 o'clock in the evening or on the weekends. So think about initially when you certainly start your practice to develop it, make as many options as you can for patients to see you. The third one of the 3 A's that I'm talking about, I think in the most important, is affable. If you can have a patient that develops trust and has belief in you and has confidence in you, they're more likely to improve with their condition. The placebo effect, which we'll talk about later, will be stronger as well. So being affable means you can develop rapport. It means you can develop trust. It means the patient will have confidence that you're going to get them better, and therefore they're going to be more compliant with their exercises and they're going to be more likely to come and see you again. So really the action is to apply the 3 things. You've got to have ability. We've talked about that. You've got to be available. You've got to be able to be communicative with people. You've got to be affable. And then if we apply those 3 things, we'll get the outcome, which is the top step of the ladder. Patient will get better quicker and there's less injury recurrence because that is really a crucial fact for people. They don't want to come back with the same problem. So I recommend to you that you follow the principle of the 3 A's. Okay, I've got some studies and some stories that really emphasise some of the matters to do with what we've been talking about the last little while. So I really want to just recap on some of these matters now about the importance of confidence building and personal development surveys. Now, we've done a number of these over time and we've looked at the results of how we see this affecting people in their practice. And it's clear that understanding some of the principles, doing the training in the practice, and using role play were areas that were crucial. So helping people understand the principles, then doing training with them, and then practicing with role play. And role play is something that I use a lot with practitioners about interactions with the way they question patients. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about the consultation and structuring your consultation. What is the process for rapport building in your own personal development? I've actually done surveys about where people we're trying to identify what personal development people might like to do. There's a number of ways people can build their confidence and personal development by understanding some of these things. It's a question that can often be dealt with mentors, but career coaches can also play a role with assisting people who are not necessarily natural communicators. And my own story from being a 3rd-year physio in orthopaedic outpatients is really around I was floundering in orthopaedic outpatients, which was something I loved doing, but I wasn't getting results. I wasn't developing rapport. And I had a third tutor who really, in many ways, rescued my career. She became aware that I was struggling. So rather than just grinding out more and more patients, she actually took me aside and did role plays with me and with the consultation. So she would be the patient and she would say, well, hang on, you could have done better here or you could have done better there. And that story was pivotal to me. I still remember her name was Pat, and I still remember the help that she gave me and how patient she was and how she was prepared to do these sessions with me outside the normal hours that a clinical tutor would do. So I think that ability to be able to be aware of that, I was aware of my deficiency, but it was she that said, look, I know you need some help. I'll come and help you. And that's often a difficult thing to do when you're just a 3rd-year trainee. But it's something that if you feel as though you're floundering, ask people, get some help. And really it's a 30-year-old quote now, but a book by Alvin Toffler, Future Shock. And this really stuck with me when I heard this and when I actually read this book. And someone gave the quote to me again some years later. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. I think we all know how important this is as we move through the digital age and deal with the fast pace of activities. I can remember going back in the days of the fax machine, but also earlier than that, before the fax machine, how if there was a document that was needed, it had to be developed on a word processor and then printed off and send in an envelope to somebody, and then you'd wait for a week for that to come back. And often that provided you with time to do things. But really, nowadays, it's all immediate. And that really applies to how you develop in your practice and be more productive, because getting back to somebody that's contacting you or wanting something from you a week later is too late now. The opportunity has been lost because people now buy on impulse and they want to be seen where they want to be seen. Now we're going to talk about how you go about structuring your consult. And once again, you can see in the slide, I've developed a model, which is actually a Venn diagram with the 3 circles. And what I want to talk about is the interaction that happens between the patient, the clinician, and then as the third part of that, the consult or the activity that's going on between the patient and the consult. And some of these intersecting parts of the circles are very important. If we look at the clinician and the patient, we can see that the intersection there is rapport. So once again, getting back to first principles, this is about communication and developing rapport. When we look at the patient and the consult, that's the experience the patient is happening within the consult, both through words, but in actions and in body language, is about understanding and engagement. So you may be getting rapport, but this is where you need to get understanding and engagement because they are getting information from you or from the consult, and therefore it's very important that they're being checked that they understand it and that they're engaged. Because if you're not engaging people, you won't get some of the key messaging that we see as essential when we're looking at the consult or the result of the consult. And really the third area of intersection is between the clinician and the consult, and this is where knowledge is really applied. So the clinician is impacting on the consult with their knowledge, with their ability to actually ask open questions and not actually, as I've pointed out in the metaphor at the bottom of the slide, jump to conclusions that can lead you astray. And really making these sorts of conclusions without the right information will often end up with the incorrect diagnosis, and this may have consequences. So try and think about your consult in relation to you as the clinician and the patient, because you'll be much more productive in the consult if you're able to understand where these intersections happen and the 3 parts of that interaction. It's not just you with patient, it's actually the consult that's happening that both of you, clinician and patient, are inputting into. So don't jump to conclusions and get astray. The more experience you have, the better you will be at actually coming up with the result in the very intersection of the 3, which is the efficacy, which is the result of the consult being a clear outcome of diagnosis, a clear instruction about what needs to be done, a clear interaction with whatever clinical techniques you might apply and whatever exercises you might give. So coming up with an outcome that then you summarise for the patient also at the end of the consult is also very important. We'll talk about this a little bit more in one of the further presentations, but I'm very big on the idea of closing the consult with a description of what actually happened, what you found the diagnosis to be. You're reiterating what actually happened in the consultation. You've got the result of the diagnosis, you've got what you've actually done to the patient, you've reinforced what you've asked them to do when they leave the consult, and then you've also arranged for them to visit you again at the end of the consult. So I might like you to take on board the idea of the 3 Venn diagram that we use with clinician, patient and consult. So really structuring the consult does create stories, and I want to give you a couple of examples of a situation whereby the patient consult was crucial to getting the correct diagnosis. And the first is from a sports physician mate of mine who often sees complex patients, and indeed a particular patient came to see him and had had 5 clinicians. I think they'd had 2 GPs, another physio and a specialist consultation, and the person had neck pain in some way, and there was pain in their supraclavicular area, and the patient was not getting better. At this point in time, there was no lump to show, but the experienced clinician that I know asked some extra questions and then actually asked a very simple question: have you had an X-ray? And in this instance, it was actually the X-ray that showed that there was a tumour behind the clavicle that was causing the patient's symptoms, which were difficult to diagnose. But this particular clinician was able to take a step back, was able to look at this a bit more objectively, and was able to actually get the patient to give a bit more information, but also to look really and see the forest for the trees, or be able to see the trees in the forest because they looked a bit more carefully. The other story that I think relates to this too is something that comes from a reading of Stephen Covey's work, where prejudging behaviour without the right questioning created a different paradigm once the questions were asked. And it's the story of a man who's in a train carriage in New York. He's got 3 little children. He's sitting very quietly on the bench of the train, and his 3 children, who are young, are running amok. They're running around, they're throwing things, they're pushing each other over. They're really misbehaving in a very bad way. And there's an older passenger sitting on the next bench who's getting irritated because these children are bumping him, and he's getting frustrated that the man is not doing anything about this situation. So he goes up to the man and he says, "Look, mate, can you look after your children? This is outrageous. We shouldn't have to put up with this. You know, they're running around, they're bumping me, and you're doing absolutely nothing." So the man who's sitting on the bench looks at him slowly and says, "Oh, yes, look, I'm sorry about that, but we've just come from the hospital, and, their mother has just died in hospital, and I took them in there for them to see her for the last time, and they were there while she died, and I guess they don't really know how to handle it, and neither do I." So it's quite a poignant example of actually coming to a conclusion without trying to work out what's going on. So sometimes we overreact. I'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about being proactive later in our presentations, about how we should often ask the extra question to get the extra bit of information before we jump to a conclusion. Okay, I want to talk about commercial behaviours now, and there's another model. I don't apologise for these models because I think it helps us illustrate some of the points that we're going to make, because you often don't hear the phrase commercial behaviours talked about when practitioners are discussing what they do in their clinical practice. So what I've done is, you'll see another Venn diagram where we've got 3 boxes, 3 circles. One is about business focus, the other is about knowledge, and the other one's about rapport. We've mentioned rapport before, but part of being commercial or showing commercial behaviour is actually around the concept of rapport. So if we look at the intersections here again, we'll notice that intersection between knowledge and rapport is the clinical aspect of what happens with commercial behaviour. The intersection between business focus and knowledge is commercial. What is commercial? How we go about applying a business focus and our knowledge of business that'll help us be commercial. Then we've got the intersection between business focus and rapport being that of balance. We're going to talk a lot about balance in some of the later presentations, but it's important to see that these 3 elements of both the clinical, the commercial and the balance are very important. And if we're going to get practice excellence, that's the intersection of the three circles. And I'll go into more what the commercial behaviours are in a moment, but I think this model illustrates the sort of concept that we're trying to put forward here. So with your commercial objectives, look at what the goals are you want to achieve in the practice management. Look at how you want the business to grow, your business or the business you work in. Plan how you develop your relationships with the referrers that you've got. Measure what you do. Diversify your services. We've mentioned some of these things before, but they're all part and parcel of being able to create objectives for each of these areas in your practice. Some of the possible key performance indicators you could have might be around the dollars per hour that you generate as a clinician, or the number of patients that you see, or the number of referrers that you've got and how often they refer, the number of personal referrals you get. And I've always said that if you have a patient who's become an advocate for you in your practice, they will refer other people. So sometimes simply rewarding those people with a letter of thanks at Christmas time, or a voucher to go and see a movie, or another sort of voucher is not inappropriate. And we do that in practices. For a GP practice that refers a number of people, will get some sort of hamper at Christmas. But more importantly, the ongoing communication is crucial to that. So keeping all of this in a record form in your referrer tracker is very important information for you. So be available, be reliable, be productive. provide service value, smile, develop rapport, be punctual, be tidy, present yourself in the treatment room you're using in a good place for people so they'll feel comfortable and they'll see it as being professional but not overly clinical. So look, today we've been through a number of different concepts for you. Really, the title productivity and how you can improve yours is a fairly broad area of topic, as you can see. It does involve a lot of aspects. It involves who can help you. It involves how you can go about helping yourself. And what we'll go through in some of the other talks and presentations that I'm hoping you'll be happy to listen to will hopefully assist you to understand better where we're coming with this. Thanks for listening today. I want you to know that I do provide one-on-one consultations, and if you're interested in such a service, please go to my website at michaelkenihan.com.au.